Thank you, everyone, for coming today. So I'm speaking today as a Marxist and as a member of Fightback. And because this topic is very personal and emotional for a lot of people, I do want to say that I'm speaking as a Ukrainian Canadian today as well. I'm sure that there are many people in the audience with a personal connection to Ukraine. Even if you're not Ukrainian yourself, you might have friends or coworkers with family there. And the past couple of weeks have been awful and stressful and heartbreaking for a lot of people. And even if you don't have a personal connection, a lot of people are just upset and unsettled and wondering what to do. People want to help. War is very disorienting. There's often a lot of confusion, and we've seen that. Most people fall in behind what the media and the state are saying. We've seen a lot of support for NATO and for sanctions and military aid, kind of as if NATO can play the role of knight in shining armor here. We've seen people lionizing and mythologizing Zelensky and the Kyiv regime. We've seen some on the left supporting Putin and Russia as some kind of anti-imperialist force. And on the other hand, there's been a turn towards nationalism and Russophobia to the point of escalating into hate crimes against Russian businesses and community centers. And then there's been the pacifist camp appealing for de-escalation and diplomacy. But do any of these approaches help the situation? Would they lead to any kind of lasting peace? And I would argue no. I would argue that to properly understand the conflict in Ukraine and to therefore understand how to end it, we need a Marxist approach. And that's what we'll talk about today. And the first thing to understand is how we got here. So I could go quite far back into the history of Ukraine and Russia, but since we have a limited amount of time, we should just start with the 90s and the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, in 1991, the USSR fell apart, capitalism was restored in Russia and the other Soviet states. There was a new capitalist class trying to establish itself in Russia and in the world. But the end of the planned economy in Russia and the end of the planned economy in all the former Soviet states hit really hard. There was, it was basically like, these countries had just been through a war. There was a huge drop in life expectancy even, and the economy was struggling. So for Western powers in the USA, this was a time of triumph. It was the end of history and capitalism had apparently won. NATO, which had formed as a military alliance of capitalist countries against the Soviet bloc and the Warsaw Pact, continued to exist, despite the Warsaw Pact coming to an end. But as Bill Clinton promised Yeltsin, NATO was a purely defensive pact, and it would not encroach into Russia's traditional sphere of influence, and it wouldn't pose a threat to Russia. But that promise didn't last long because then in a few years, the Yugoslav wars broke out. And despite the protests of Russia, NATO engaged in bombing campaigns. And Western powers basically used the war to get a foothold in the region, which very much demonstrated Russia's weakness. And NATO did expand its membership over the years, 5 times, in fact, absorbing more and more Eastern Bloc countries into the fold. So that's the first thing to understand is this general pattern of Western powers, Western imperialism, expanding at the expense of the interests of the Russian ruling class in the region. And of course, Ukraine would not be left out of these attempts to extend Western influence. All the big political conflicts in Ukraine over the past 20 years really have been about this, whether Ukraine would be subject to the imperialism of Germany, the EU, and ultimately the US, or whether it would remain under the sway of Russian capitalism. So you basically had different competing groups of oligarchs backing different politicians and coming under the pressures of different capitalist powers. That's what the 2004 Orange Revolution really came down to. And that's what the 2014 Euromaidon coup was about. And it's really important to understand 2014 and the aftermath to understand what's happening today. Now, NATO might not have troops on the ground in Ukraine, but what we're seeing now is ultimately a struggle between the interests of Western imperialism and the aspirations of Russian imperialism. And I think what happened in 2014 really demonstrates that and helps to explain that. So 2014, then President Yanukovych had promised to sign an agreement with the EU that will bring Ukraine closer to Europe economically. And then at the last minute, he switched tack and signed an economic agreement with Russia instead. And protests broke out over this and over the general corruption in the government. And these protests were also partially driven by the illusion that closer association with the EU would mean greater prosperity and less corruption. This is what the Euromaidon movement was. While there was genuine opposition to corruption in this movement, when the issue is which imperialists the country was going to subject itself to, really neither side is right. The whole thing was reactionary, and it did quickly come to be dominated by right-wing and far right-wing elements. And of course, Western powers took the opportunity to get actively involved as well, like the Canadian embassy, for example, acted as a base of operations for protesters. John McCain came to speak to the Maidan protests. And in the end, Yanukovych ended up fleeing his post, and a pro-Western government that was eventually headed by Poroshenko came to power. Now, Poroshenko, initially, he didn't initially have this like anti-Russia position. What he ended up doing is he signed deals with the International Monetary Fund, which if you don't know what they do is they offer loans to governments on the condition of sweeping privatizations and austerity. And it's basically they destroy countries. The period after the Euromaidan movement actually saw the worst declining conditions for Ukrainians since the 90s. And Poroshenko's whole strategy then ended up being to lean on ultranationalism for support, including extreme right-wing and fascist groups, and to blame Russia for everything. And then this is also the time that Russia annexed Crimea, because that's where Russia's fleet is based. And that whole thing sparked an even further rightward swing in the Kyiv government. The Russian language, which is the first language of about a third of Ukrainians, lost its official status in the regions where it had had that status. And communists and trade unionists were targeted and oppressed. In Odessa, there was one kind of skirmish that ended with fascists locking trade unionists in a building and setting it on fire, killing 42 people and injuring hundreds. And it's in the midst of this that the separatist movements in Donetsk and Luhansk, which are provinces in the east of the country and majority Russian speaking, this is when their separatist movements sprung up. And then when Ukraine tried to put down the separatist movements, they couldn't, due to the popular support for separatism in the Donbass, and due to the fact that the army wasn't reliable and the soldiers didn't want to, go and kill other Ukrainians, which then meant that the government went and leaned even more on the fascist battalions, integrating them into the National Guard because, they were fanatical and reliable. The Minsk agreements were supposed to end the conflict and, recognize autonomy for the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, but the Kyiv government, basically ignored those and has been shelling the Donbass for the past 8 years. Now, I think it's important to point out that Putin doesn't care about the people of the Donbass. The leadership in those republics now is entirely dependent on Russia. They might have had some progressive elements in the separatist movement at one point, but they have all been overturned or killed by the Russian state. As I've said, they've been bombarded for 8 years, and if Putin or the Russian state cared about them, they could have intervened at literally any point before now. So the independence of the Donbass republics is not what this conflict is actually about. So anyway, Moving on in time, Zelensky, the current president, was elected in 2019 on the basis of a vague anti-establishment, anti-corruption appeal. He had this kind of outsider cachet because he wasn't a politician, he was an actor and comedian. And his success was also based on the promise to end the civil war and quit with the ultranationalism. His opponents actually accused him of being a Russian puppet. But he's backed by the same set of oligarchs as the previous government. His main backer who owns the channel that played its shows, among owning other things, he was heavily associated with the Euromaidon movement and is one of the richest men in Ukraine, and really just like a ruthless gangster all around. And so Zelensky, he did not keep his promises at all. He's continued to implement austerity, these IMF austerity programs, continued the civil war, and kept up associations with fascist groups. So that's the second thing to understand, that Ukraine is governed in the interests of these oligarchs who are being pushed and pulled by imperialist powers, and they use these national and nationalist divisions to prop them up. Now, turning to Russia, Putin came to power about 22 years ago, taking over from the very unpopular Boris Yeltsin on the promise to reestablish Russia as a global power, to consolidate it as a capitalist power. He was initially very popular and was very popular for a while, mostly thanks to high oil prices, which were a boost to the Russian economy. It made it seem like, oh, everything was going well. But as the economy dwindled in Russia, so has Putin's appeal. There have been an increasing number of protests against his government, and his government is relying more and more on outright state oppression. And in fact, the most recent election, this past fall, is widely recognized to have been rigged to allow him to win, which wouldn't have been necessary in the past. So he has to, kind of work to maintain his position now. And, what's better for a boost in popularity than a war? And then coming back to the global context, in recent years, the USA has shown signs of being overstretched and relatively weaker. And there's been signs of divisions between Western powers. The US and its allies, including Canada, they withdrew in disgrace from Afghanistan. In Syria, Russia was the one to throw its weight around and take control of the situation rather than the USA. So we have Western powers who are wavering, and a more confident Russia looking to gain back the clout that it lost. And it was in the midst of all of this that the talks and negotiations around NATO expansion were taking place. The general process that's been unfolding is one of the USA and its friends trying to strengthen their foothold in Eastern Europe versus Russia trying to reassert itself. And Putin can't risk appearing weak. Now, Ukraine is still an important market for Russia. It's got the pipeline going through it to sell gas to Europe. And of course, militarily, Russia would not want NATO at its doorstep, or any more at its doorstep than it already is. Meanwhile, Biden didn't want to back down either. He doesn't want to look weak. But at the same time, he said, the US isn't going to defend Ukraine militarily. While at the same time, he was continuing to ramp up its belligerent language and not make any concessions on the question of NATO expansion. So, given those hands in the game, what do you think is going to happen? And that's how we wind up where we are today. So, when Marxists ask, what caused this war, we don't look at what world leaders say. They're always going to paint themselves in the nicest possible light. We don't believe Putin's explanation, that he's defending the Donbass and denazifying Ukraine. He's not doing those things. And we don't believe the Western explanation either. We don't believe that they're altruistically interested in the dignity and independence of Ukraine. We look at the underlying forces. This war didn't happen out of the blue. There's a process at work that brought us to this point, and that process is imperialism. So what is imperialism in the Marxist sense? It's not just invading other countries. It's an inherent result of the development of capitalism, the highest stage of capitalism, as Lenin put it. And in the simplest terms, it's the monopoly stage of capitalism. And I'll explain what that means. So like when capitalism starts out, it's based on competition. Whoever produces the better product more efficiently gets the profits. That's the libertarian ideal of capitalism. But capitalism does not remain in this state forever. What happens when there's competition? One side wins, and the side that wins basically eats the smaller one and gets bigger, and then becomes harder to compete with. So as this process of competition plays out, there are fewer and fewer players on the field, and those that are left are very powerful. And capital is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, which I think we see very clearly today with the growth of monopolies. As this happens, finance capital and the banks come to dominate over industrial capital or manufacturing. With the drop in competition, there's less of an incentive to invest in and to innovate in the field of manufacturing. So more and more profits are generated through speculation as opposed to anything really productive. And the capitalists merge with the state. They're tied to the state by 1,000 threads of economic interests and personal relationships. And what happens when these monopolies get too big to extract satisfactory profits from their home markets is that they have to expand past national borders, to control resources, to gain access to markets, to block competitors, and to gain new fields for investment from which to extract profits. And it's because of this that the world gets divided up by imperialist powers, because capitalism necessitates it. Imperialism isn't a policy choice or an ideology. It's a material necessity for capitalism to survive. This definition comes from Lenin. And one thing to note is that this definition isn't meant to be taken formalistically or formulaically. Formalism is antithetical to Marxism. So like back in 1916, Lenin counted Tsarist Russia among the great imperialist powers, even though it was subservient to other imperialists and still had some feudal characteristics. Canada is an imperialist country, even though it's heavily dependent on other imperialists. Imperialism isn't a checklist of characteristics. It's how capitalism operates internationally at a certain point in its development. So anyway, in this way, the world gets divided up between the imperialist countries based on who's more powerful. But the thing is that balance of power doesn't stay the same forever. Capitalists ascend and decline on the world stage. When the division of the world no longer reflects the balance of power, imperialists will seek to redivide the world. And the way this happens is through war. World War I is a classic example of this. Germany was an ascendant capitalist power and was challenging other imperialists for their spheres of influence. Wars are not fought over ideas or principles or international law. They're fought over capitalist interests. And that is what we're seeing today. The war in Ukraine is a war over whether Ukraine is a vassal of Russia or of Europe and the USA. It's over who gets to profit off of privatizing the Ukrainian economy, who gets to exploit Ukrainian labor, who gets key military positions. And it's about depriving the other side of those things. So this is a war between Western powers and Russia, and Ukraine is just the staging ground. And that's something that's not immediately apparent because NATO itself doesn't have troops on the ground, but the Kyiv government is itself a proxy. It's backed by Western interests, which isn't to say that Ukrainians are not genuinely fighting to defend their homes, they are, but that's really one of the despicable things about this conflict, is that NATO countries are the ones who picked the fight, and then they left Ukrainians to deal with the consequences. When you understand the underlying forces at work here, it becomes clear that there is no progressive side to this conflict. No, Putin is obviously reactionary. The Russian state does not care about Donetsk and Luhansk. It just wants to use them as a bargaining chip in negotiations with Europe. To justify the invasion, Putin said that the objective was to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. But the idea that the Russian state is in any way anti-fascist is frankly laughable. The Russian government is a right-wing regime. It suppresses workers' rights and democratic rights. When Putin first came to power, he was supported by the Russian capitalists because they were afraid that the Communist Party was getting too popular and they needed someone to represent them. That's who Putin represents, is the Russian capitalist class. And Putin looks to Tsarism for inspiration, and he leans on Russian nationalism for his popularity. And the invasion is not going to help get rid of fascist battalions in Ukraine. Coming in as a foreign invader, claiming that Ukraine is a made-up country and belongs to Russia, is exactly the type of thing that provides fuel for the right wing. And those who aren't pushed to the right towards Ukrainian nationalism will be pushed to the right towards Russian chauvinism. So this invasion is being carried out in the interests of the Russian ruling class and no one else's. The side of NATO, isn't any better. The USA remains the greatest source of reaction and oppression in the world. NATO is a murderous alliance that has destroyed one country after another, from the devastating bombing in the Yugoslav wars to the utter failure of the war in Afghanistan to throwing Libya into civil war. NATO powers, Canada included, have blood on their hands. And then there's the hypocrisy. They talk about democracy and international law. What did democracy matter when the West was backing Juan Guaido's attempted coup in Venezuela? What did international law matter when the USA invaded Iraq? The irony is that their hypocrisy really laid down the blueprint for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with all the talk of peacekeepers and defending the rights of Russian speakers. NATO countries, the EU, the USA, Canada, they don't care about Ukrainians. They didn't care when they were pushing for IMF austerity policies. They didn't care when they were arming and training Nazis in Ukraine, which is what the Canadian Army did and what the Canadian Army is still doing. The talk among top figures in the US, now in the Washington Post, is now about turning Ukraine into another Afghanistan for Russia. Dragging out the conflict for 8 to 10 years so that Russia gets bogged down and worn out. They're developing these fascist battalions the same way they developed the Taliban. That's the scenario that they're rooting for, is to destroy Ukraine for the sake of undermining Russia. So no, they don't care about Ukrainians. And I do have to point out that we don't support the Kyiv government either. It is a proxy for Western powers backed by gangsters, leaning on fascist elements that has been conducting a one-sided civil war for 8 years. Many Ukrainians justifiably hate this government. So while Ukrainians will obviously want to defend their homes from invasion, we don't create illusions in Zelensky or his government, and we don't act like their interests are the same as the interests of Ukrainians generally. So whichever way you cut it, the outcome of this conflict is reactionary. The outcome is dead Ukrainians and Russian workers, a devastated country, a population that will be more divided than ever, and that will be dominated by one or the other imperialist power. That is the outcome of capitalism. Capitalism means conflict and misery. And capitalism does not provide a way out of this mess. So, then what do? Do we just accept this? Are we neutral because all sides are bad? No, Marxists have a position. We take a side. We are anti-imperialist. We take the side of the working class. And in practice, what that looks like aiming our fire at our own ruling class, recognizing that the enemy is at home. So why is that, and what does that mean? So I'm going to contrast the Marxist approach to other approaches that we've seen. The main response to the war so far in general has been to support our government and call for more intervention. This has been the way most of the general public has reacted, as well as much of organized labor and the left, which is not surprising. In the first instance, war tends to shock the population into standing behind its government. But when we criticize NATO or sanctions, a common response is, but we have to do something. At least our governments are doing something, and Putin has to be stopped. And this is exactly the same as going to a burning building with a bucket full of gasoline to pour in the flames, because at least that's doing something. At least it's a liquid. So what can Ottawa or other Western governments do? There have been calls to implement a no-fly zone over Ukraine. which means shooting down Russian planes that enter Ukrainian airspace, which means a dramatic escalation in the conflict and direct war between Russia and NATO, as opposed to proxy war. And I think we should all understand why that's undesirable. There's been the provision of lethal aid to Ukraine and the Ukrainian army. And I keep seeing fundraisers put on to raise money from average people, fundraising for the Ukrainian army. And again, this means arms and resources going to Nazi battalions, but that are integrated with the Ukrainian armed forces, for the sake of drawing out the conflict as much as possible, rather than bringing it to a quick end. Then there's sanctions. You see a lot of people talking about sanctions like they're this powerful weapon against Russia. We should be clear that sanctions have never affected a policy change. They didn't work in Cuba or Venezuela. They didn't work in Iran. They haven't worked in Russia for the past 8 years. So why would they work now? The Russian ruling class knew sanctions were coming. They prepared for this. The only ones who suffer are the Russian people. Sometimes you hear the logic that sanctions are meant to turn the people against the government, as if Putin's government, which again rigged the last election and has been suppressing protests for years, cares about the Russian people. Usually what sanctions do is that they push people into a siege mentality, and this plays into the hands of their government, who can then say, see, the whole world is against us and we're your defenders. And again, it's average Russians and actually average workers around the world who pay the price of sanctions. These sanctions are affecting the world economy and contributing to inflation, and everyone's standard of living is taking a hit for it. And then along with sanctions comes kind of, the little cousin of sanctions, these ridiculous and useless boycotts, like taking Russian vodka off the shelves, barring Russian athletes from sports, which then fans out into all these performative gestures of like renaming things, refusing to play Russian music or read Russian literature, etc. And then this inspires people to turn against anything Russian and to harass Russian businesses and vandalize Russian community centers and churches. And this is a thing that has happened in British Columbia. To call it by its name, these are hate crimes. And they're the logical conclusion of the everything Russian bad approach. The Russian people, Russian workers are not our enemy. Ukrainians and Russians have family and friends and connections on either side of the border. The Russians getting arrested for protesting the war are the best friends Ukrainians have right now. And these boycotts and sanctions only hurt them. And of course, it bears repeating that we can't turn to NATO to help in this situation because, again, NATO countries do not care about Ukrainians. NATO countries contributed to the escalation of this conflict. Now, another response we've seen from some on the left has been pacifism, calls for negotiations and a return to diplomacy, appeals to the United Nations and international law, calling for Canada to be a force for peace. And while this impulse towards pacifism is understandable, it's also entirely unrealistic. Calls for diplomacy and negotiation ring hollow when Putin isn't interested in peace. Or he's interested in peace on Russia's terms, which means a totally demilitarized and subservient Ukraine. The idea that there can be a negotiated peace is a tacit acceptance of imperialism. There's this common saying from Clausewitz that war is politics by other means. And you can see that very clearly in Ukraine. The past couple of decades have been about who gets to dominate Ukraine. And Russia's invasion didn't change that. It just brought military force into the equation. War takes over when diplomacy isn't getting the desired results. And diplomacy between imperialists is still imperialism. We don't support the solution of imperialist powers sitting around a table to divide up Ukraine. Russia does not have a right to have Ukraine in its sphere of influence, nor does the West for that matter. But calling for negotiations has as its base the acceptance of the legitimacy of imperialist interests. So there's no just division of Ukraine between imperialist powers. And again, neither Russia nor NATO actually wants peace right now. Any appeals to international law are toothless. The United Nations General Assembly, can vote for whatever it likes, but it doesn't mean anything. How many times has the GA passed resolutions condemning Israel's actions in Palestine? I don't know, because it's been like a lot. It's been many times. And of course, Russia and China both have a veto on the Security Council of the United Nations, so that's not going to do anything either. International law is really simply the codification of power relations. When it's not that, it's just words on paper. Again, what did international law mean in Yugoslavia or Iraq? And the idea that Canada can be a force for peace is likewise misguided. It's buying our own press. Saying Canada is a force for peace is like saying tigers can be a force for veganism. Canada has been one of the most hawkish of the Western powers on Ukraine. Canadian weapons manufacturers are looking to build plants there and get contracts. And I can't repeat enough, Canada has been arming and training Nazis in Ukraine. Canada is not a sweet little peacekeeper wringing its hands at all this nasty violence. Canada is a full participant in Western imperialism. And the fact is, even if there was a negotiated peace tomorrow and all the troops withdrew and Zelensky and Putin shook hands, all the conditions that led to this war would still exist. Capitalism is becoming increasingly unstable. The old powers are not as unshakable as they once were. And regional powers will continue to challenge the main imperialists for spheres of influence. Wars are an inevitable part of capitalism. The problem with pacifism is that it ignores the interests of the ruling class. War suits them very well, and it ignores the class struggle. It ignores the fact that the working class of any nation does not have the same interests as its ruling class. Our governments do not represent us. Wars are waged in the interests of capital. And the only way to effectively fight against capital is with the power of the working class. To end wars, we need to end capitalism. And that's why we say the enemy is at home. Our enemy is our own ruling class. The main enemy of Russian workers is in Moscow. The main enemy of American workers is in Washington and on Wall Street, and ours is in Ottawa, in the provincial legislatures, and on Bay Street. Because first of all, that's the ruling class that workers in Canada are in a position to bring down. With mass actions, strikes, expropriations. We don't support the Russian state, but if we were to point at the Russian state as our main enemy, that would by necessity mean lining up behind and supporting our government against it. When our governments and our capitalists are the ones who have undermined our quality of life with stagnant wages and cuts to things like healthcare and education, who break strikes, who use the police against workers and against oppressed groups, all while they make war overseas, a war which we pay for, by the way. So this is a practical question. The Canadian ruling class are the ones we can fight, and bringing them down would benefit the struggle of workers around the world, wherever Canadian imperialism has extended its reach. Fightback is part of the International Marxist Tendency. We have supporters around the world, and our comrades in Russia are facing arrests, fines, and violence for attending and organizing protests against the war. We support them by opposing our capitalists. We oppose sanctions, we oppose military intervention, and we oppose anything else that sets the working class of different nations against each other. Now, this is the Marxist approach to war. It's a working class position. It's an internationalist position, and it does work. It was revolution in Germany that ended World War I. It was, organized resistance in the US Army and unrest at home that finally brought an end to the Vietnam War. And revolution, socialist revolution, is the only thing that can end the conditions that create war by ending capitalism. Lenin wrote, our aim is to achieve a socialist system of society, which by eliminating the division of mankind into classes, by eliminating all exploitation of man by man and nation by nation, will inevitably eliminate the very possibility of war. So that's what we stand for. And you look around the left, and not a lot of organizations have this position. Most unions have uncritically taken up the slogan to support Ukraine, which in the current context and without saying anything else means supporting whatever actions our government takes in the conflict. The NDP have come out strongly in favor of sanctions against Russia. They all fall for the bourgeois line on the war rather than taking a working class perspective. The Marxist approach, the class-based approach, is not a very popular one at the moment, but it is the correct position. However, being correct is not enough. We need to fight for this approach on the left in the working class organizations. We need to build support for militant Marxist leadership instead of the right-wing leadership that currently exists. And that's what Fightback is trying to build. When people ask, okay, you Marxists think you're so smart, what's your solution for the war in Ukraine? How do we end the war? The answer is that in practical terms, there is no good outcome in Ukraine. And that's because the working class around the world does not have the kind of militant, class-independent organization that it needs to have a significant impact. And that's the tragedy of it. But that doesn't mean that we don't do anything. We need to build. We need to get Marxist ideas out there. We need to win support for them in the movement. We need to build a revolutionary organization, one that is capable of taking a stand against imperialism, one that's capable of ending it. We end war with revolution by replacing capitalism with true democracy, with workers' democracy, replacing a system that's based on producing for profit and based on competition with one that's based on producing for need and on cooperation, replacing capitalism with socialism. There will be more wars as long as capitalism exists. It's up to us to do the work now so that in the future, the working class will be capable of ending all wars once and for all. Ni winy między narodami, ni miru między klasami. No war between peoples, no peace between classes. Thank you.